Hello, and welcome to Chad's ADHD 365 podcast. This program is sponsored by Tris Pharma. Tris Pharma uses Liquid XR technology to develop innovative medicines that address unmet patient needs, including the treatment of ADHD and related disorders. Tris Pharma is dedicated to keeping patients with ADHD and their families educated and connected. Visit www.trispharmaproducts.com to find educational resources and more information on Tris Pharma's treatment options for patients 6 years and older with ADHD. Hello, and welcome to ADHD 365. I'm your host, Susan Booney, and with me today is Dr. Mark Burton. Dr. Burton is a developmental pediatrician based in New York and also a mindfulness teacher. Welcome, Dr. Burton. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about yourself?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here again. It's always great to see you. I'm not sure off the bat that I would think I need to add anything more than that. I do developmental pediatrics in New York. I try to integrate mindfulness into practice when it seems appropriate. And I think we can just jump in. Looking forward to, seeing where things go today.
Okay, great. Well, my first question, does poor diet cause ADHD?
That's a great question and a frequent one that people start with. But really, bottom line is ADHD is one of the most genetically programmed disorders out there. And poor diet certainly does not cause ADHD. There is a little bit of research about, not even very definitive research, suggesting some nutritional deficiencies might complicate it. There's a tiny bit of research about things like food dyes influencing ADHD, like they don't cause it, but potentially can exacerbate it. And there is a little bit of research as well saying things like omega-3s might help a little bit around the edges. But in spite of all the online chatter, nutrition does not cause ADHD.
Thank you. But can ADHD lead to poor eating habits?
Well, that's a much more interesting and loaded question, and really one I think worth looking at. I think the impact of ADHD is kind of underestimated in many different situations. So I think a good starting point in really thinking about ADHD overall is that it's not specifically an attention disorder. It's a disorder of a much bigger skill set called executive function, which has to do with our life management skills. And I'm not going to give I don't want to spend too much time on that today, but the point is that it certainly affects many, many different life habits pretty directly. And it's been linked with things like overeating, difficulty with becoming overweight, binge eating, and eating disorders. So definitely ADHD, can increase your risk of various challenges around food and eating. I think one thing that's also related to that in a very subtle way, I'm not sure it's studied as directly, is also that when you have a child who maybe, for the subgroup of kids with ADHD, it's not all of them, who are really challenging behaviorally when they're young, fighting over food may just be the last thing on your plate. You're sort of exhausted and overwhelmed as a parent to begin with. So it just becomes that much harder to even introduce healthy eating in younger kids. And that may be a piece of a family dynamic also.
Does eating an unhealthy diet have an effect on ADHD symptoms? Is good nutrition important?
Well, I think good health as a whole is quite important for ADHD. So again, just to put it in bigger context briefly and then come back to nutrition, ADHD quite often undermines healthy habits overall in ways that can make your ADHD worse. And some of that can do with poor sleep. Some of that can do with exercise, and certainly with nutrition. Anything that helps you with your overall health and well-being is going to help your overall ability to manage any given day. So, like I mentioned a moment ago, there's a little bit of research saying that food dyes and particular deficiencies could theoretically exacerbate things. But I think overall, the more important context, if the goal for all of us is health and well-being in some broad sense, we do know that ADHD affects healthy living habits as a whole, including in the three I usually summarize are eating, sleeping, and nutrition. And that if we can get a handle on that, it's sort of like a domino effect of we'll feel better, which will help us around some of our ADHD symptoms more specifically, maybe, and which will also, when we feel better, it also just makes it easier to do the things we need to do to manage ADHD. So there's probably a direct effect of healthy living on some ADHD symptoms, as well as just increasing our capacity to, handle the fact that ADHD calls for an awful lot of persistence and self-management just to stay on top of it. And it'll help with that too.
Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between ADHD and disordered eating, binge eating, eating for stimulation, anorexia, etc.?
Well, I think I'll put it in the big context first and then specifics. I mean, when you look at, I think that there's several different aspects of ADHD that affect eating overall. I think we haven't touched on that yet. So I would say overall, you have, on the one hand, I think sometimes it's easier to break things up a little bit around, some of the impacts of ADHD. You have the kind of old school kind of core symptoms of ADHD that most people are familiar with. And you can easily see, in a shorter talk like today, I won't explain it too much because hopefully, the link is clear, but how things like distractibility and impulsiveness, can directly affect how people eat. That's, so there's that direct effect of some of the foundational symptoms of ADHD. The more important concept, I think, for anyone living with ADHD is to start really understanding the idea of executive function in like a useful way. It shouldn't feel like as some more sort of wonky scientific thing, but it is ADHD. So the better you can understand executive function, the better you can manage it. Executive function includes two other components of life that directly affect eating. One part of it is organization, planning, time management, so that if you're kind of under planning things and falling behind in different ways, that affects things like what foods are available when it's time to eat. That affects, what foods are available at home or meal planning. All these things that start accumulating over time. So the organization and planning piece of executive function can affect how you eat. And then a huge one, which I know my friend Roberto Olivardia, who talks about this all the time, also talks about frequently, is that ADHD affects emotional self-management skills, and emotional reactivity and managing our emotions is clearly something that's very linked to eating for many of us. So you do have this baseline of, ways ADHD affects eating. And then, ADHD probably, as a subset of all of that, although, I think it's impossible to draw, to say it's exactly, A leads to B specifically, but almost certainly because of some combination of all of that, ADHD has been shown to link to more specific eating disorders also, like binge eating disorder and anorexia, even, and other, specific eating disorders. So ADHD increases your risk of more severe eating disorders also.
So, Dr. Burton, what should parents watch out for in their children with ADHD as far as issues with eating? When should they become concerned?
I think that's a great question. And, it's hard to shorthand something that's such a broad topic, but to some degree, like a lot of things in pediatrics, it isn't necessarily different than other kids. It's just a matter of knowing what to look for. Like a lot of, typical development's going to happen with or without ADHD, and ADHD might increase the risk, but the answer isn't all that different. So, sometimes I think the simplest way to shorthand the difference between what's typical development and what's not, as simple as it seems, is that anything within the range of typical development shouldn't be causing, what the word you use in the textbooks often is impairment. So you shouldn't be, causing yourself a chronic problem of some kind. And, that's where the judgment lies. But I think it means that if there's certainly physical signs of any problem, clearly kids need to be evaluated, extremes of weight. Emotionally, I think it has more to do with some of the more disordered patterns you see around things like anorexia and binge eating, which, the end point is weight, but some of those signs you might pick up on earlier if somebody, just through observation that somebody's eating seems extreme. And then some of this, I think, which is, probably something we're going to touch on today some as well, really just comes from being sort of trying to stay proactive and ahead of it through trying to create an atmosphere of just, balanced, healthy eating habits from the get-go. And I think that is, lots of kids are fussy about food and want junk food and want sugar and all those things. And that's part of life. And, it's one of the challenges as a parent is how to sort of navigate through all of that and get some sort of vaguely balanced eating habits in place anyway.
What are some of the ways parents can encourage good eating habits?
Clearly, the most important one in most households, because it gets ahead of the more challenging things we may or may not touch on today. But, what you model is sort of the starting point for many, many different things, even, more challenging things in ADHD. You want to teach someone how to manage their emotions. It starts from how they're seeing everybody else in the house manage their emotions. So when it comes to food and eating, it's very similar. I mean, you don't want, it's really hard, particularly around food, to say, don't do this, but, you should eat this way, but I'm eating this way. So, modeling is vital as well. That relates to something. There was a nutritionist who was part of my training, and it's not always the most nuanced in how we talk to people, I guess. But so, I might bring this up differently, but certainly one of the early questions you would ask parents around, some situations, but who does the shopping at home? And I think, you don't want to judge yourself for it, and everyone has their foods they like and don't like. But to some degree, that's true of just, you want to just raise kids in a household that is balanced, whatever that looks like to you. In the end, like a lot of parts of science in general, but certainly health and well-being, there's no yes, no answer about how to eat, as much as just seeking some kind of balance. And a lot of that is just like what's around when you're growing up, and not being afraid of setting limits sometimes. I don't want to get too, there's such extremes when it comes to eating. I can only talk in general. Clearly I'm not talking about situations where people are truly lacking food. That's a whole other, sad and epic topic to touch on. But in sort of mainstream America, most of this country, there's just a, excess availability of, processed, unhealthy stuff around all over the place nowadays, including school lunches quite often. And a friend of mine who needs to address who's trying to, because of health reasons, addresses health in this way, said, after he was talking to his nutritionist, he went to the supermarket and realized that pretty much if he left the produce aisle, there was nothing that was particularly helpful available to him. And he was being a little extreme. But it does come down to, that idea of kids, partly because they have immature executive function in the first place, like they're with or without ADHD, they're not the grownups yet. They're not ready to make big, long-standing decisions in life. Ice cream is always better. So that's a long roundabout way of saying, it starts with sort of modeling and lifestyle and setting some boundaries when they're appropriate, so that kids just have a routine day-to-day level of health. I'm going to just pause there, but that's where I would start.
So let's talk about mindfulness and eating. What is mindful eating?
Let me just sort of normalize that to start, and then I'll jump in. In the bigger picture, because mindful is just being oversold as a buzzword everywhere. So I think actually I'll start with my favorite thing to say about mindfulness, which is it's just a word. And one of my favorite sort of teachings around mindfulness that drew me into even studying it is the concept. One of the teachers said that ask of anything you hear, is it true? So when it comes to mindfulness, there's a whole premise of like, don't take any of it on faith, just like listen. And if it sounds right, make it real for yourself. And, that's really important to me because, I'm not saying it's a quick fix for anything, but I do think it's a practical add-on, practical help for many, many things. So when it comes to, mindfulness, when I was organizing my thoughts for today, I think there's two different things we can think of. In general, mindfulness is a useful intention for any situation. And there is some benefit to just practicing that way. So in general, what mindfulness means is trying to live life with more awareness of what's actually going on as it's happening, there's different ways to define it, but kind of with less judgmental reactivity, like this is what's happening. If I like it, I can enjoy that and try to manage that well. And if I don't like it, I'm still not going to like it, which is a subtlety with mindfulness. It doesn't mean I'm suddenly going to like it. It means I'm still better off being aware of myself and not getting caught up in reactivity and trying to steer myself towards managing it well. And that clearly, in fact, one of the most fundamental ways to start exploring mindfulness can be through food, because if you look at that intention of living life with awareness, where more in life do we just get lost in autopilot and not pay attention to what's actually going on? In so many different ways. In that, when I often talk to kids about this, it's like when you like a food, what do you tend to do? You tend to just get so caught up in eating as much of it as you can possibly get your hands on that you sort of eat so quickly you don't even taste it. You don't even enjoy it at all. Like when I lead mindful eating practices, one of the things I often hear is that, people got more enjoyment out of far less chocolate than they normally eat, because you just actually pay attention, and it's not supposed to be forced or weird. It's just that's valuable in life. During the pandemic, I've been talking to people a lot about how part of sustaining our resilience in life is that it's so easy to get caught up in the fact that things are going poorly all the time, or seemingly going poorly all the time, I should say, that if we don't stop and pay attention to the positive stuff, we're going to burn ourselves out. It's just an important part of life. And then the flip side, especially for kids, is if you have to eat something or are told you have to eat something you don't like, then what happens? Then you slow down and you pay so much attention to it that you're torturing yourself. So there's so much around eating, that it can become a practice of just paying attention to what's actually going on. And it tends to, again, increase our enjoyment of eating quite often. And then the second part of mindfulness, which is not as intuitive, but is equally important, is that as we start that process, one of the things we notice, which is clearly valuable when it comes to food and eating, is that we tend to get caught up in a lot of just like habitual reactions around everything we do. We just kind of, this is how I eat. This is what I eat. When I'm hungry, I just must do this, or, we have our preferences and they're all real and hard to change, but we're not always aware of them. And one of the examples I sometimes give around food, which is just a valuable reflection on the difference between really difficult to change habits and something that actually is unchangeable. There are things in life that are unchangeable, is that you can look at all the various reasons in life we're asked to fast for short amounts of time. So some people do it, like for a medical reason, you can't eat today because you're having a procedure tomorrow. And some people do it for religious reasons. So like if you're Jewish, Yom Kippur is coming up and you fast for 24 hours. And one thread you can look at among that is that, this is why it's called non-judgmental awareness, by the way. I'm not saying this is easy in any way. You can look at the fact that for 364 days a year, it feels like, we've been fighting to eat healthy, all of us in different ways, probably our whole lives. We all have things that are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that again. For 364 days a year, those things seem impossible to touch. And then all of a sudden, some doctor or, at synagogue, they say, well, tomorrow don't eat. And you're able to do it. Everyone does, right? You can. And it's miserable and you're hungry and it's unpleasant, but you don't add that second piece, which is the habitual thing you typically do when you're hungry. So, it just shows that it's like, well, it's incredibly entrenched and difficult and we shouldn't judge ourselves for that, but it is doable, which is a subtlety that's worth exploring because, it's the ability to live with something a little unpleasant without reacting to it. So when it comes to what you asked, which is like, what does mindful eating mean? It means there's two sides of it, like I said. One is we certainly can just bring the intention to bring awareness to eating. That is takes a lot of effort. It's something we aren't doing already, most of us, most of the time. So some of it is the intention to be aware of how we're eating. Little things like just eating more slowly leads to healthier eating just by nature. And there's lots of little tricks you can do that aren't meditation, but just like literally are logistical tricks you can do that help slow things down. Just be more aware of both eating while we're eating. And then equally importantly, a big part of the practice of mindfulness is recognizing that when we slow down, we more easily connect with our best intentions. Like we know like the right thing to do awful lot of the time and lose touch with it. So, as we're eating, we can be aware of, why we're eating and how we're eating. And even one thing I wanted to touch on is, mindful eating doesn't mean only giving attention to our food necessarily. If we're eating with a friend or eating with our family, then being aware is being aware of that as fully as possible, not on our phones or catching ourselves if we're caught up with a work problem and just saying like, what, that is real. But right now, the most important thing is I'm having dinner with my kids and try to just give our fuller awareness to our kids. So when it comes to this broader idea of mindfulness, part of it is the intention to eat with awareness, to make choices around food with awareness, to examine, am I eating because it looks good or am I eating because I'm hungry? And in a non-judgmental way, just try to explore all that. So that's the intentional side of it. And then the other part of it is that mindful eating can be a specific practice. So you can make a practice of it. You can develop these various traits that relate to mindfulness through eating. And that's the harder part of mindfulness, honestly. It's basically like a gym program. The practice of mindfulness, the intention is through doing something over and over again. Anything we repeat over and over again becomes more accessible, becomes more part of life. Anything we choose not to do becomes less and less part of life, again, within that range of what's possible. So a mindful eating practice is actually making a structured meditation of, sitting with something we're eating. Again, it's not meant to be forced, but it is meant to be structured, looking at just for a few minutes, all the different senses, basically, sight and smell and taste. And it's a wonderfully enjoyable practice quite often. Really, gets us back in touch with something that we might go weeks or months without really paying that much attention to. Every once in a while, something we really like just sort of grabs our attention, but mostly we're not paying a whole lot of attention most of the time. And that's actually making mindful eating into, an actual structured practice. And the intention there, again, there's no doing it right or wrong, and we're going to get distracted and lose touch with our intentions. And all of that happens. It's an important concept when it comes to mindfulness practice is, There's no perfect. Everyone has a hard time with it, with or without ADHD. But if we practice regularly this concept of like when something's going on, this is what it's like to give it our full awareness and attention, it becomes more and more part of life. And so mindful eating as a practice involves, specifically choosing, like, some people sometimes recommend, like, at the start of a meal, just do it for a couple of minutes, or a couple of, just bring our awareness fully, and then, just go back to eating like normal again. So that's what mindful practice is more specifically.
Thank you. Now, when there's low executive functioning, whether it's a kid with low executive functioning,
right,
or a teen or an adult,
right?
Do you have any tips on how to practice this mindful eating, and encourage good nutrition when either you're a parent dealing with kids with low executive functioning, or an individual dealing with low executive functioning?
Well, again, I think those are two different answers. I mean, one specific to mindfulness and one general to ADHD. So, since I was talking about mindfulness, I guess I'll start with that one, which is that, I mean, part of it with mindfulness is just, normalizing it, like just what is. So in other words, it's not supposed to be perfect, and no one can focus their attention fully on anything for very long with or without ADHD. And all of that's fine. So that, in fact, I think that's true for any meditation practice or any mindfulness meditation practice, is just, if you're going to stick with it, you have to recognize that it's fine if your mind's busy the whole time. It's fine if you're restless. The practice is the practice, and that's all that matters. So when it comes to mindful eating, I think the simplest way to start is to say, just let go of any expectations. It isn't supposed to be anything in particular except practice. So that's probably the core part of it. And then the second part of it is, for anybody who gets started with mindfulness and meditation, it's forming a new habit, which is really hard. So you have to give yourself A, leeway to screw up a lot, and B, if you're going to be successful with habit formation, it requires, because it's not a habit, initially a lot of structure and reinforcement and planning. So if it's your intention to practice mindful eating for a while, making any new plan stick, if it's, at the start, means, scheduling it, setting alarms, or asking someone to partner with you or to remind you of it, just like any other habit in life. And then you can take in the bigger premise, which I don't know that we have time for today, the overall practice of mindfulness is meant to spill over into everyday life in a way that just makes you more aware of what's going on, and work with habit and reactivity in any situation, so that over time, you might be able to start catching yourself when you're making impulsive decisions or habitual decisions around food. One habit-related change I like working with nutrition that I've found very successful over time, actually taught to me by the same nutritionist I mentioned earlier, is really most of the research, from the way I understand it, says dietary change is best done as a gradual thing towards a healthy lifestyle. Healthy lifestyles can stick. Anything extreme, people tend to give up on pretty quick. And one of the nicest ways to drift towards that is really just like find one thing that's kind of habitual and you'd like to change, and just change that one habit, like whatever it is, switch from potato chips to pretzels, or, and even with kids, you can often make those little changes and just look at the household as a whole, and just like one step at a time in small ways, just recognize, oh, that's just a shopping habit, or that's, we can shift that. And it's usually tolerated that way. So that's on the mindfulness side of things, it's about being, in a patient, non-judgmental way, being self-aware enough to recognize things like, we tend to eat with each of our senses at different parts in the day, but obviously it's healthier to try to come back to, am I hungry or not most of the time, which is hard, but we can start exploring that. I'm not, and that's all the bigger picture of mindfulness. The practical side of ADHD is just recognizing that anything, when you're working with kids in particular, is that anything that comprehensively addresses ADHD will, by nature, make it easier to manage eating and eating habits. So, certainly, there are, when it comes to the mindfulness part of things, anything having to do with mindfulness in kids, you have to sort of just make playful and adapt to their age, or just, it's never that radical as much as just understanding where they are developmentally. And, there's a great book, for example, called No Ordinary Apple, which is like a picture book for, kids still reading picture books. And it's just, eating an apple through the picture book. And, it's really guiding a mindful eating exercise. And so there's ways you can bring it down to really young kids as long as you make it playful and engaging. However, it's never, mindfulness is something we put in the context of ADHD care. So if you work on, the medications have been shown to help with eating, particularly around binge eating, other areas of eating disorders, the medications can, it's a little complicated, can cause some problems, but you have to medications can be a piece of it. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be a piece of developing the tools to manage all the ADHD, emotional and executive function issues that relate to eating. And then the big one I think every parent should focus on, or should is a big word, but might benefit from focusing on, is just recognizing that so much of getting a handle on ADHD is, benefits from sort of a parent training approach, not because parents are doing anything right or wrong, but because it's hard to manage ADHD, and giving parents more tools so that they can manage the behavioral side of ADHD clearly helps with some of the eating stress that happens at home too.
Absolutely. So what about when medications are in the picture? And sometimes some medications in some people can suppress appetite. If there's a co-occurring sleep disorder, and some of the sleep medications that are given can also interfere with eating habits at night. Can you talk a bit about that and what parents and individuals can do?
When it comes to, medications to ADHD, I mean, I would think I would make, the starting point for me is that I think if you manage ADHD medications, really, really persistently and push, try lots of different things, for most people, you can find a medication that has, not necessarily zero, but minimal impact on appetite. So I do think it's important to start there, because I think sometimes really what does need to happen is a medication change. Because even though it's frustrating, if you just keep working on the medication changes, it can be grueling. But if your appetite is really, really suppressed with the medications, you're not only not hungry, but you don't want to push somebody to eat when they're not hungry. That's not a great message either. So I do think it's really important to start there, because I think sometimes I find that people have, been, sitting with the medication for a long time that's causing a lot of appetite suppression. And there might be another option out there that causes less. And it's very random. Two medications that on paper can cause the same side effect don't always individually cause that same side effect, for you. So I do think that's really, really important, because if it's extreme enough, it's, there are ways to work around it by trying to push calories beginning of the day and end of the day and things like that. But my goal is to not have things be that extreme when I'm managing medication, for sure. The second thing to know is that, bodies try to self-regulate. So if the eating issues are mild, meaning, they're eating some during the day, but less than usual, most kids really will make up those calories. It almost goes back to the first thing. Like, most kids, if the issues are mild, will make up the calories at the end of the day, in my experience. And as long as they're staying on their growth curve, it may look different, but it's not a health issue quite yet. And then if that's not true, that goes back to my first statement, which is, if it's so extreme that they're losing weight, maybe we have to reconsider which medication they're on. Yeah.
Well, we've gotten questions from parents about teens, especially, who may not be eating all day long because their appetite is decreased, and maybe they're getting involved with a lot of activities during the day. And then they binge eat at night, or they get up in the middle of the night and eat.
Right.
So we hear that from parents quite a bit.
Well, again, if we're focusing, I don't want to, get into the emotional eating disorder side of that for the moment, but in terms of just the medication, I would still have the same starting point. Like, if your appetite is so decreased, you're eating nothing all day long. And I'm not suggesting that everybody can get there, but certainly my first choice would be would start switching up the medication so that you're at least hungry enough to eat something. That's my starting point always. The second thing is that, because of, general busy life, hyper focus, poor planning, all those other things, some of those teens just need reminders. It's just like you just have to be a little more structured about having snacks available, reminding them to have a snack. It's harder with a teen, but many kids, I find, it's like their appetite's kicking in kind of as they're falling asleep. And, that can lead to some sleep issues. So you just sometimes have to be a little structured about offering a snack. Like if you remind them beforehand, they might say like, oh yeah, I'm kind of hungry. So some of it has to do with that same sense of like adults sometimes have to provide extra structure to the lives of, even teenagers with ADHD in that way. So, I think really those are the two sides of managing it. On the one hand, trying to really question, not question if a child needs medication. That's not what I'm saying, but questioning whether that medication can be changed to something that affects appetite less. And then the second thing really comes back to that broader concept we were talking about just reinforcing habits and structure of just, if it's important that somebody, do a snack every time they get home from school or do a snack, before bedtime so they can sleep through the night, how can we create the external system that sort of reinforces that and make sure it happens most of the time?
Thank you. That's so helpful. Now, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to talk with us about?
I think we covered a lot. I just think we should end with something that I think is foundational with ADHD and really part of mindfulness practice too, which is just recognizing, again, I'll end by saying, where I started with mindfulness of always look through the language, just forget the terms can be a little wonky, but, we're just trying to do our best to put words to an experience. The reason mindfulness is often called non-judgmental awareness is because we're often looking at ourselves or looking through at life with just a lot of reactive judgment, meaning, it's not just that we made a mistake. It's that we're just, lame and I should do, I do this all the time and everybody else wouldn't. And they're all looking at me. And there's just this pile of judgment that gets carried on in life that just complicates things and makes it much worse. And so non-judgmental awareness just is that we're trying to build this ability to just see things exactly as they are without all that extra. And when it comes to this entire concept of eating, much less parenting as a whole, I just think it's important to recognize that it's hard for everybody. We're all struggling in different ways with all of this. Everybody's got their stuff. So to say like, when we step back, we're going to, whatever word you use, practice mindfulness and like really just look at like what's actually going on here. There's a way to practice also self-compassion and not getting caught up in the judgmental side of it. Recognizing like I've been doing my best for years. This is just the habit I've fallen into. It's, it's not so helpful anymore. So I'd like to work on changing it. And I don't have to blame myself for every time I, do whatever it is that I've habitually done, overeat or this, that, or the other thing. It's more because everybody does stuff like that. Everybody's got their thing. So that I think is an important part to bring to this discussion because it's so easy to feel judged when it comes to, eating and eating habits and healthy lifestyle. So there is that's all. I just wanted to end by saying, everyone's doing their best and everyone has stuff to work on. So, recognizing that, hopefully we can find the space to make some small changes that make our lives easier.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. These are all very important points to remember.
All right. Well, thank you again for being here. It's always great.
Thank you for listening to this podcast supported by Tris Pharma, the makers of Liquid XR technology. Tris Pharma is committed to supporting the ADHD community through education and innovation. Learn more at www.trispharmaproducts.com. Thank you for listening to another episode of Chad's ADHD 365 podcast.